Notes on the unity and separation of the senses from Stephen Dowling's Introduction to Frederick Jameson. It is typical of Jameson that a few remarks, several incidental observations on the history of painting, should contain beneath the surface a sustained meditation on human history. We must begin by relating these few remarks on painting, not to actual paintings, but to a time before painting, a certain golden and irrecoverable moment in the human story, when the visual arts did not yet exist. For paintings and statues and artifacts, like all aesthetic objects in Jameson's view, can only come into existence through a process of alienation and estrangement within human society. In an unfallen social reality, there is no painting, because there is as yet no need for painting. The name of this unfallen social reality in traditional Marxism is primitive communism. Jameson's vision of primitive communism, though it begins in the notion of a stage before relations of domination emerged in human society, has clear affinities with the pagan myth of a golden age of Saturn, in which property was common and slavery or subservience non-existent, with the Christian myth of the Garden of Eden, even on a more abstract level, with Hegel's notion of being, as yet unnegated and estranged from its own self-identical nature. Jameson would admit and even welcome these affinities, with the proviso that such myths are for Marxism precisely stories told by people living under relations of domination to diffuse or manage the intolerable contradictions of the societies they inhabit. Primitive communism is not a myth in the sense that a golden age or a Garden of Eden is a myth, then, because it is an actual state of human society. Since primitive communism serves for Jameson so powerful a heuristic function, that is, the ideal standard against which he measures all later stages of fragmentation and alienation, that it is for him something actually to be found in the world. What is significant for Jameson as a student of culture is the mode of perception, the way of being in the world that primitive communism may be imagined to represent. Yet this is impossible to imagine directly. There is a moment of what post-structuralism calls aporia here, an irresolvable bind or logical paradox that teases and frustrates the mind with its very irresolvability. For the unhappy fact is that as creatures of history, locked away in the private and separate and lonely worlds of our own consciousness, the separation and the loneliness having been produced by the implacable market forces of a capitalism that constitutes human beings as individual units or subjects in order to function as a system, we cannot imagine what it would be like, in the purest sense, to think collectively, to perceive the world as a world in which no such thing as individuals or individuality existed, to think not as a member of a group, but as the group itself. This is the moment of aporia or paradox, then. When I am in a group, I cannot conceive of myself, no matter how closely I am bound to its members by ties of love or habit or shared interest, as thinking as that group. The best analogy for what Jameson has in mind for such collective thinking, an analogy caught in St. Paul's vision of the Christian church as a mystical body, and subsequently taken over by mystical thinkers through the Bible and beyond, is the way any individual in this fallen social reality inhabits their body. For it is only with the emergence of relations of domination and the underlying economic forces that inexorably produce them, that there begins the long process of social transformation that brings us at last to the terminal estrangement of late capitalism, each of us locked within the solitary prison of their own mind, our minds themselves, the effect or product of a global market system that, in the name of efficiency or rationalization, breaks everything down into units and assigns those units an interchangeable value. Yet even in the first moment of estrangement, that first tribal moment, when the social collectivity begins to separate into individual members or units, the world loses something of its fullness, its presentness as a world, what Jameson will call its richness or its vividness of color. Thus, even the perceptual world is implicated in the newly fallen social reality to which primitive communism gives way. To speak of the world's losing fullness, or vividness, or color in the fall into alienation and estrangement is to run the risk of sounding impressionistic or vaguely mythopoetic. And in fact, Jameson runs this risk quite cheerfully, seldom pausing to say just what he means in using such terms. And yet, his meaning is perfectly rigorous. Let us begin from the simple intuitive notion that a fragmentation of anything like a collective mind must to some degree impoverish the perceptual world for those individual subjects who inhabit the new reality that ensues. To just the degree, let us say, that my loss of sight or hearing or taste must impoverish that fuller reality I knew when my senses were unimpaired. The fall from primitive communism into alienated or estranged individuality is accompanied for Jameson by an interior fragmentation, a process through which the senses become estranged from one another and begin to function autonomously, just the way that individuals in the world ushered in capitalism will not only function independently, but learn to congratulate themselves on their freedom, autonomy, and the like, and through which, as well, the various functions or levels of the mind become similarly estranged and independent in their working, with the purely abstract or rational level splitting off from the emotional, the empirical or descriptive faculty alienated from the perception of meaning or value, and so on. This notion of an interior fragmentation lends Jameson's thought much of its sometimes bewildering complexity. For at least since Kant, we have known how inseparable are reality and perception. And Jameson's argument will always demand that we hold in a simultaneous focus a world objectively estranged or fragmented, and a perception of that world existing in the mutually estranged faculties and senses of the individual mind, just as powerfully constituted by the alienation of its elements from one another and from the whole. Nor will Jameson allow us the comfort of choosing one process of estrangement over the other, the inner over the outer, as though, for instance, the fragmented world of our interior perception were merely an irremovable lens through which we were compelled to look out on a world actually coherent and whole. What historical materialism teaches is, to the contrary, that the process of alienation is universal and all-pervasive, and that unless this is understood, there is no understanding history as such. There one has, almost as a parable, an example of Jameson's mode of dialectical analysis, one that sets even a few parenthetical remarks on the history of art, one artistic medium, against the background of a total theory of history, from which nothing, the eye that views a painting, the mind that perceives it, the nature of which it is a formal expression, can ever be exempt. There remains only one final point that gives Jameson's thinking about human culture a special depth and inclusiveness. For not content to unmask painting, as the outward symptom of an implacable process of alienation and fragmentation, he will assert as well that it is a glorious compensation for this process. That from Michelangelo to Jackson Pollock, art has also existed to answer the deepest needs of a humanity for whom the world was being steadily drained of its immediacy and color. The author goes on to discuss the insistence that criticism may be a positive as well as a negative enterprise, and that it may honor what Jameson calls the, quote, utopian dimension of human culture.